So then we were asked, Harvard was asked by the government of Iran to send an advisory group to Iran. And David Bell, the head of the Pakistan project, and I had in the meantime become acting head of the Pakistan project. I started out as an advisor, as an assistant to the advisors. I was not considered old enough to be a full advisor. I started out as an assistant to the advisors, but I ended up as head of the project. Then I went back to Harvard together with David Bell, who was the senior person, to manage the Pakistan and Iran projects. We then, David Bell and I, said to Harvard, to Edward Mason, there is a lot of demand for the services of Harvard to provide advisors. Many countries like to have the prestige of Harvard. So it's not a good idea to do this on a project-by-project basis. We ought to set up a service that stands ready to provide advice. And Mason agreed to sponsor this, since he was very influential. It was on the way of being set up. When David Bell left Harvard to become head of the Budget Bureau in the US government under President Kennedy. And later he became head of the US aid program, and later yet vice president of the Ford Foundation. So he left Harvard, and I was left behind to continue working on developing this development advisory service. Now, I was then asked by Kenneth Galbraith, who had become ambassador to India, whether I would come to India and head the aid program, which was a wonderful opportunity. This was the biggest aid program in the world. Galbraith was on excellent terms with Prime Minister Nehru of India, and he was on excellent terms with President Kennedy of the United States. So he was very powerful, and he offered me the job of aid director, and he told me that he would not interfere with my running the aid mission because he had other things to do. So I was eager to accept this offer, and I went to Mason and said I've been offered this wonderful job in India, and I would like to go. And he said, Gus, you cannot do that. And I said, why not? And he said, you and David Bell talked me into setting up the Development Advisory Service, and David Bell has left, and if you leave, who's going to run this advisory service? I'm getting it set up. It's all set. It's on the verge of coming into existence. I'm not going to run it. I did it because you urged me to. Now you can't leave and leave me with this advisory service and nobody to run it. And perhaps foolishly, I told Galbraith I couldn't come,
Mm-hmm.
and I stayed behind to manage the advisory service. First as deputy head and then as head. Now, I've taken a long time to answer your short question. So that's how the advisory service came into business and
Mm-hmm.
became its head in most of the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So now you've mentioned a lot about how the DAS came about and some of the complications, some of the origins of the DAS. And you mentioned that you were offered a job in India
Yeah.
by John Kenneth Galbraith. Were you aware of the MIT India project, and were you at all corresponding with them about their work and what they were doing? And I'm
No,
asking, the reason I'm asking is because the way that the MIT India project is especially now projected in the research that people do, in the historical research, they say that the MIT India project was basically the field in which US policymakers first tried out new forms of development aid. This was, in a way, tested out. Foreign policy measures via aid, they were tested out in the MIT India project. Yeah, so.
no, uh, by the time of the Kennedy administration, I don't think there was an MIT project anymore in India.
Okay.
Um, I was in India in 1955.
Mm-hmm.
From Pakistan, I went to India to see what I could learn about planning.
Mm-hmm.
And the MIT project was much closer to the US government than the Harvard project was,
Mm-hmm.
because um, the MIT projects, and there were projects not just in India, they were in three I countries. It was in India, Italy, and Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
There were three projects um, run by three different eminent economists.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the head of this whole operation had been in the US government. I forget his name now.
Walt Rostow and Max Millikan.
Max Millikan, correct.
Mm-hmm.
He had been in the US government and I believe in the CIA, no?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So he was close to the US government
Mm-hmm.
and they might have been much more cooperative with the US government than we were.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and that was true in both the Pakistan and the Iran project, and later on in the Indonesia, the Argentina, the Colombia, the Ethiopia. Uh, the advisory service had many projects,
Mm-hmm.
very successful,
Mm-hmm.
and we always, our position was we were working for the government of that country.
Mm-hmm.
And if we dealt with the US, it was on behalf of that government. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when I went to India in 55, I met with P.C. Mahalanobis,
Mm-hmm.
who was considered the father of Indian planning, and Pitambar Pant, who was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission,
Mm-hmm.
and with others in the Planning Commission. And um, this was an interesting experience for two reasons. Some of the people in India said they did not expect Pakistan to survive. They expected Pakistan to come back and become part of India because it did not have the personnel to run a country of that size. Um, they, they underestimated the ability of human beings to adapt to new situations. The incentives were correct. The other thing that was interesting was that Mahalanobis and I got into a big argument because he said, you are keeping Pakistan from being a successful developing country by opposing Pakistan developing a steel mill and instead advocating that Pakistan develop a fertilizer plant. Because he believed that Russian success was due to its development of steel mills. Because if you had steel mills, you could produce machinery for manufacturing, develop manufacturing, and that was necessary to be a successful country. This was based on the assumption that you couldn't buy steel by way of trade. We thought of countries as not engaging in significant trade, because if you were dependent for your steel on American steel producers, you would always be a dependent economy and you could not become independent. Now, our argument was that Pakistan had no coking coal and it had no iron ore. India had, yeah? So it would have to import the coking coal and the iron ore. It might as well import steel because it had no basis for the steel industry, yeah? It had, however, natural gas, which was the basis for a chemical industry and above all for producing fertilizer, which it needed for its agriculture. So it was better off importing steel, producing fertilizer, rather than importing fertilizer and producing steel, which required it to import all the ingredients for steel production. And it also had no people who knew how to run the steel mill. So it would need to import people to run the steel mill also.
So would you say this was an impact of your work that the Pakistani government decided to go for a fertilizer plant and not for a steel mill? Was this part of your development of advisory work in Pakistan?
Yes. There were people who had the same attitude. They said India is developing steel mills, so we should develop steel mills. And there was a great deal of agitation for developing steel mills.
Yeah.
Eventually, Pakistan did produce a steel mill, but our advice was to delay this and to put the money into fertilizer plants so that Pakistan could produce its own fertilizer.
Which in a way made a lot of sense because Pakistan as well as India at the time were much more agricultural countries than they were able and close to industrial production.
Yes, but that didn't mean we advocated also that Pakistan put up textile plants and jute mills. So it was not that we were opposed to industrialization.
Yeah.
We're just opposed to industrialization that would require that all the ingredients were imported.
Mm. But for the case of India, for example, there's often the argument and the pointing out the mistake of the Nehruvian government that heavy industrialization was so much more seen as positive than agricultural modernization. Agricultural modernization came basically with the Green Revolution, and this was somewhere in the 60s.
Yes.
So
Yes.
do you see in Pakistan an earlier impact of your policy to support, of your policy advice to support fertilizer production?
But
Did they improve in agriculture earlier than India?
yes, but you also needed to have industrial development because otherwise you couldn't employ uh, all the people in Pakistan. You couldn't employ them all in agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
You needed to develop industry, but it should be industry that could use materials that were available in Pakistan rather than industry that had to import everything. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, India followed the Russian model.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, that was the principal reason uh, that they were emphasizing the production of steel and of machinery,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which employs fewer people,
Mm-hmm.
but they already had textile mills and jute mills.
Mm-hmm. So do I understand correctly that in a way Pakistan was much less of an import substituting economy because the focus on industrial development was different?
No, it was very much an import substituting economy, but it was import substituting on consumer goods.
Okay.
And then it became an exporter of these consumer goods.
Mm-hmm.
It was a highly successful industrial development. It was the most rapid in the world, matched only by Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Also had rapid development of industry at that time.
Mm-hmm.
From 1958 to 1965, it was rapidly industrializing. First, on import substitution, it was producing the yarn and the cloth that Pakistanis needed for clothing. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it was also producing matches and soap. It had no industries of any kind, of any significance. So matches had to be imported, soap had to be imported, um, cooking utensils had to be imported. All of these things um, were very quickly produced domestically.
Mm-hmm.
Then uh, Pakistan provided strong incentives for people to go from import substitution into export production.
Mm-hmm.
It became very profitable to be an exporter
Mm-hmm.
because you got an additional bonus for exporting. And
Mm-hmm.
there were rates of return that were 50 to 100%. That is, in 1 year or 2 years, you could earn back your investment.
And
Incredibly profitable. Yeah.
for how long do you think this went on in Pakistan? How long was this the case? Did you follow up when? At,
It was highly successful. The country was growing rapidly until the war of 1965 with India.
mm-hmm.
Um, Pakistan expected this war would end in a stalemate. Um, and this was also supported by the US military attaché who believed the same thing. the view in Pakistan was that India would occupy East Pakistan, which could not be defended. But by the time the Indian army reached Dhaka, the capital of East Pakistan, the Pakistan army would be at the gates of Delhi. Because Pakistan had the better army, the better tank corps, and they expected the Pakistani tanks to break through and move down the typical route of the conquerors of India, like the Mughals, who also came through the Indus Valley, and they would be at the gates of Delhi. Of course, that turned out to be totally wrong. The Pakistanis got defeated. They never got beyond the Punjab in India. The Indians fought them to a standstill. They lost most of their tanks. And so when they finally had an armistice, they had not conquered India. They had lost most of their tanks, and they spent the next few years replacing their tanks and spending huge amounts of money in order to continue to keep up with the Indian army. And there was not enough money for government expenditures to support industrialization. And the successful development of the country slowed down tremendously or came to a halt beginning in 1965. And then Zulfikar Ali Bhutto became prime minister, and he nationalized the banks and other institutions, other private businesses, and of course private investment came to a total halt. He did this in the name of benefiting the poor, which of course he didn't do. He nationalized everything, including the cotton gins. And that led to tremendous inefficiency because the cotton gins were now run by people who were staunch supporters of the People's Party, of Bhutto's party, but knew nothing about cotton gins or anything else. Pakistan's development slowed down tremendously. And our advisory group came to an end as well.
When was this?
It came to an end about 1970. But we had lost much of our influence by 1965, after 1965. We had been also tremendously successful in the period from 58 to 65. We had a very good chief of team there, who'd been an assistant to Hopkins, who was the principal advisor to Roosevelt. And he understood that the key was employment, creating jobs, and very successfully advocated for that in the Pakistan government.
So Roosevelt, meaning this person, what was his name? Sorry, I forgot. Hopkins. Hopkins, you were saying, did he have anything to do with the Marshall Plan?
Well, Hopkins had influence on everything, but
The reason I'm asking is, was his advice for employment modeled on an early experience that this would be successful if you focus on generating employment from the European experience, maybe?
No, it was based much more on the American experience during the Great Depression. That the key to Roosevelt's success was to create all sorts of agencies that provided employment, not just in reviving industry, but he had the Civilian Conservation Corps, which provided jobs for young men who couldn't find any other jobs. And they did trails in the woods, and they did post offices, and they constructed various infrastructure in a labor-intensive way. And he recommended and got developed in Pakistan a program similarly that provided funding for infrastructure development in the rural areas, especially on a completely decentralized basis. And one of the key problems for people who were working in agriculture was that during the off-season in agriculture, when you were not planting or harvesting, there were no jobs. Yeah, people had nothing to do, but they also had very little income because there was no agricultural work. And this program employed people during the off-season to build rural infrastructure. So they built roads from villages connecting to the central road system. They built irrigation works. They built drainage works. They did reforestation. They did all sorts of things that helped the rural areas develop. And they did this when they had no other work. So it reduced poverty greatly. It was especially successful in East Pakistan.
Interesting. And when was this effect felt of his advice of Hopkins? Right from the beginning of the Pakistan project?
His name was, the person's name was Gilbert. He had been an assistant to Hopkins.
Okay.
Hopkins never went to Pakistan. Okay. No. The head of our team was named Richard Gilbert.
Richard Gilbert, okay.
He had been an assistant to Hopkins.
And but this yeah.
He had an economics degree, and he worked as an economic assistant to Hopkins. And then when the democratic administrations came to an end, he came to Pakistan and was very successful. He became a close confidant of the finance minister of Pakistan. And through him influenced the Pakistan government. And now, the other thing that he came up with, he was a very smart guy. How do you pay for this program? Because you have to fund it, yeah? And the Pakistan government didn't have any lot of spare money. So he said, you fund it by selling surplus U.S. agricultural commodities in Pakistan. And if you sell wheat and rice, if you bring wheat and rice from the U.S., which the Pakistanis get basically for free, yeah? You put it into the Pakistani economy, it lowers the price of wheat and rice in Pakistan, and makes it more difficult for Pakistani farmers to earn a living. And they will reduce their production of rice and wheat if you import a lot of rice and wheat. So what you need to do, you're increasing the supply, you need to increase the demand also to keep prices stable. Increase the demand by using the proceeds of selling these commodities to pay for this works program.
Wow.
So you are increasing the supply, but when you give money to poor people, what do they spend it on? They spend it on food. Especially during the off season, when they used to have too little money to buy much food. It will increase their consumption of wheat and rice. Now, so people said to him, no, you're completely wrong. Maybe this will work in West Pakistan because the US has mostly wheat. It has very little rice. And the Bengalis of East Pakistan are rice eaters. If you give them more wheat, they will not eat it. And Richard Gilbert said, if the price is right, people will buy it. And the price of wheat is half the price of rice. So when you imported more wheat to East Pakistan, they didn't eat bread, which they were not accustomed to eating, but they eat donuts.
What did they eat?
Donuts. Fried, the wheat is fried in a round shape.
Paratha.
But it's fried, it's not bread. It can be made sweet. People eat it as dessert. They also ate the wheat as noodles. So they are not bread eaters, but they are noodle eaters. So they could use more wheat even in East Pakistan, as long as the price was sufficiently low. And since Pakistan got the wheat for free, they could set the price wherever they wanted to. So you increased supply and you increased demand, and production did not suffer. Consumption improved.
Do you see a specific difference between the Pakistani wheat program and the India wheat program? The PL 480 in India it was.
This was PL 480, but India never used the PL 480 to support this kind of public works program.
Yeah, that's right.
It was just used as general income for the government, yeah.
But so the Indian government also did not increase the price for the rice and wheat that was imported. They kept it as it was, or they distributed to the population.
Well, the problem was, if you imported more wheat and rice because you got it free from the US, yeah, you increased the supply, then the price would fall, which was good for poor people, but bad for production. That's always been a problem with PL 480. If you have large quantities of it, it tends to reduce the price and to reduce domestic production. But he solved that problem by increasing the demand. And that was very clever of him.
Very interesting. So now we've already talked a lot about, in a way, different perceptions of economic development for Pakistan and India. One can argue that Pakistan was very successful for many years in development.
But only for this period of before 1958, it was also successful in the sense that it developed an industrial base, which it never had. But it didn't grow rapidly because it had very few good institutions. It had to develop new institutions. It had to develop a government.
Mhm.
And it had to absorb refugees as a much larger proportion of the population than India did. The number of refugees was about equal in the two countries. Hindus fleeing Pakistan and Muslims fleeing India, but it was a much larger proportion of the population of West Pakistan than it was of India. It was a very large group. So these had to be absorbed, and a new government had to be founded. A central bank had to be founded. All these institutions didn't exist. So it was successful in the sense that it developed these institutions from 1947 to 1957. But after 57, it was very successful in growing more rapidly.
Mhm. Very interesting. So I read an article by you, which is titled "Aid, Foreign Private Investments, Savings and Growth in Less Developed Countries." It was published in 1973 in the Journal of Political Economy,
Yeah.
where you make an argument that foreign aid was much more important, had a much greater effect on economic development than foreign private investment.
Well, the main argument I was making was that it was a positive influence on development, unlike some people who said it was all wasted and useless.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
It was a big argument at the time that showed that countries that received the most aid didn't develop the most rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
That was, of course, based on false assumptions about the direction of causality.
Mm-hmm.
Countries that received the most aid were often countries that had been in desperate straits, like South Korea, where the country had basically been destroyed by the Korean Civil War. So they received a lot of aid, but they didn't grow very rapidly because what they were doing was reconstructing the country.
Mm-hmm.
So you said they received a lot of aid, but they didn't grow rapidly. That showed that aid was useless. Well, without aid, they would have been in desperate situation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to exclude countries that received a lot of aid because they were basically destroyed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the countries that received the most aid were South Korea and Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Taiwan was an island that absorbed the the, the Kuomintang who were fleeing mainland China. There were a huge number of refugees there. Again, it was a desperate situation. They received aid because both they and Korea were close to the US, but also because they were in bad shape.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing was true with countries that had suffered from great drought. They would receive large quantities of PL480 in order to feed their population, but they didn't have a high rate of growth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you took account of this fact, where the direction of causality went the other way, then you could show that aid actually was quite beneficial. And that was the big argument at the time, is aid useful or all wasted in corruption and mismanagement? Because
Who made that argument primarily?
economists. many economists, there was a book by Lyman and Cole on Korea, for instance, which said the principal aim of the Korean government is to maximize the amount of aid it gets from the US.
Mm-hmm.
It focused, and that was true under the Sigmund Rhee government. And they also said Korea will never develop because of their culture. So the aid is mostly wasted because the culture is hostile to development. It's a Confucian culture in which prestige and goes to people who do not work with their hands, who are abstract scholars, and who don't deal with real world problems. And therefore, because of its Confucian culture, it will not develop. And this book came out just in the year when Korean development became the big success story. And it was very embarrassing for these two guys, both of whom I know. They had just said Korea will not develop. It was all based on the notion that culture dominates everything, and because of Korean culture, it will not develop. And of course, it wasn't developing because there were no incentives for people to do what you needed to do for development. There were incentives to use US aid for consumption. And then a new dictatorship. Sigmund Rhee had also been a dictator, but he was an unsuccessful dictator. And then there came a successful dictator, and Korea became the great model for rapid development, right?
Mm-hmm.
The opposite of what they had just argued. Mm-hmm. Out a year too late. So that was there were a whole slew of articles that tried to show that aid was wasted. The US should spend the money on American needs and not waste it on trying to help developing countries. The argument was the Marshall Plan was successful because basically these were developed countries who had been destroyed. So what they needed to do was rebuild the infrastructure that had been destroyed, and the country would boom. Not the country, the region would boom. As long as you kept the countries from going to war against each other, and of course Germany and France no longer were interested in fighting. As long as they cooperated, Europe would grow even more rapidly because it basically had all the things in place that you needed for development, except the destroyed infrastructure. So Marshall Plan was paid for rebuilding the infrastructure and for the countries to cooperate, and all would be well. But you couldn't apply that principle to Asia or Africa or Latin America. Because those were countries that had no experience of developing, and they would just waste the money.
In terms, so that's very informative. In terms of the debate, were you on the side, or were you in the mainstream? You and the ones who worked in the Harvard Development Advisory Service.
Well, now you have to distinguish the advisory service differ depending on which country you're talking about. Okay,
True.
um, um, in Indonesia, we were very influential from the beginning. In Pakistan, we were influential from the beginning until 1965. Uh, in Argentina, we were never very influential uh, because the dominant political group were the Peronistas, and their economics were inherently designed to be failures in terms of economic growth and success only in terms of satisfying their political supporters. So we never were very influential there. We were on the side. We never developed a single theme, a single point of view of the world as a whole. Um, you couldn't say that we had a single outlook on uh, the world. The one thing we were always clear on, as long as I was director, um, we were not working for the US government. Now, uh, I don't know if you're interested in this, but because your principal interest is India, but there came a time in Indonesia when our financing came from the US government. And the Bush administration had an aid director in Indonesia who believed that because they paid for us, they could tell us what to do. And um, they called me in and said, you misunderstood your mission. You think you're working for the Indonesian government, but we are paying you. So you are working for the US government, and you will now tell the Indonesian government, give the Indonesian government the advice that we will tell you to give them. And I said, how long do you think the Indonesian government will listen to us once we do that? They are not stupid. They will quickly realize that we're giving them advice that the US government wants us to give them, and that is not in their interest. And the aid director said to me, we are paying you a lot of money, so you will do as we say. And he said, you cannot see any senior Indonesians, much less a minister, without one of us being present. And I said, that is completely impossible, because if you are present, they will not tell us what is on their minds, because they will tell us what they are willing to have you hear. And you are a different government. We're either advising the Indonesian government, or we are working for the US government. We're not working for the US government. You're financing us to advise the Indonesian government. He said, no, no, no.
Mm-hmm.
We're working for the US government. You will do as we tell you to.
Mm-hmm.
So,
When was this? When did this take place? Do you remember?
well, this was when the Bush administration came in. When was that?
The first
The
George,
first Bush, yes.
late 80s, early 90s. Bill Clinton came 93, I think.
What year?
Bill Clinton, his term of office started in 1993.
Okay. So uh, I then ended my work for the US government. Yeah. I stopped working on the project, but I stayed on in Indonesia for a short while longer because I was interested in what was happening. And I went to see some of the people I knew who were ministers, and our project chief was called in by aid and was told Papanek has violated what we have said. He has met with ministers without us being present. Put him on the next plane out of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And the mission chief, our project director, came to me and said, this is what AID has told me. I have to put you on the next plane out of the country. And I said, go back to the aid director and tell him I laughed when you told me that. And I said that the only way you can get me out of the country is to go to the Indonesian government and ask them to declare me persona non grata. Then I have to leave. But if you want to get me out of the country, tell them that you have no way of getting me to leave because I have a visa and it's good for another 30 days and I have a ticket to leave when I'm going to leave, and I have no power over him because he's no longer working for the project.
Mm-hmm.
So he went back to the aid director and told him what I had said. And the aid director said, if you can't get him out of the country, I will. And our head of our team said, yes, sir, I'm glad you will do that because I can't do it. And of course, he had no way of doing it. They terminated our project, which meant that we all left, except that one of our project directors stayed on with funding from, forget from whom, maybe the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank or UNDP or somebody. We continued our work, but with only one person, because at that time that agency did not have enough money to fund the whole team. So they terminated our project.
But this was not during your time at Harvard. This was at your time during your time at Boston University.
Well, yes, it was by that time a BIDE project. It was not a Boston University project.
Okay.
Because by 1990, I was no longer chairman of the department, and the whole situation had changed because I had a falling out with the president of Boston University.
Mm-hmm.
We had founded BIDE in 1987.
Mm-hmm.
So that we could continue our work without Boston University.
Mm-hmm.
So answered only one or two of your questions, I'm afraid.
No, it's all very good. I mean, I'm trying to adapt the questions that I had prepared as we go along, and I think you're answering all of the questions that I've basically put out. So that's all very good. But when exactly did your interest in Indonesia start? This was much longer, much before this.
Oh, yes, the Indonesia connection started in 1962.
Mm-hmm.
But we should soon end this and continue another time because I have a bunch of other things I need to still deal with today.
Okay, of course.
So if you want to get started on the Indonesia project, we should perhaps, we've been at this more than an hour, yeah? Is that?
Sorry, say it again. Say it again.
Well, we have been talking for more than an hour.
That's right, for more than an hour now, and that's totally fine to stop now. And we would then continue next time with the Indonesia project and basically your current work on Indonesia. Those are the two topics which I would like to discuss.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay.
Do you want to set a time or a date today already, or do you want to see?
We can do that. Um, um, uh,
You were saying on 15th you have.
no, I expect to be able to move that um, injection to a week later at least, because the 17th is expected to be the peak of the coronavirus season here.
Yes.
So going out of this place on the 16th is just the day before the peak, and my principal physician, my primary care physician, wants to avoid me being out where I could be infected at the peak of the season.
Yep.
So I'm trying to postpone this as late as possible. We don't, I mean, I'm willing to continue on Tuesday or Wednesday
Yeah.
Of this coming week.
Yeah. Both days are good. Tuesday or Wednesday. I'm completely fine with both. You should say which one is better for you. Or you can decide. You can decide later, and we'll decide. You can tell me Monday morning.
Okay, and is 2 o'clock or 2:30 okay?
2:30 is fine. It's completely fine. You should do it. We can be very flexible about this. That's not. It's not a. If you're coming back from another appointment late and you need to finish your lunch, then we can always postpone it by half an hour. That's not a problem at all.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I'd like to do it after lunch, and so
2:30 is good.
Is easier for me than 2 o'clock.
Yep.
So let's say 2:30 on Tuesday. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm trying to redo my will.
Yeah.
And that's a major task, but
Yeah.
it needs to be done. And I would have kept putting it off like most people do, but I think given the